Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Gaze of Doubt. The late afternoon sun kissed the city streets, creating a dazzling backdrop of shadows and golden hues. Jasmine Mitchell, a force of nature wrapped in a tailored blazer, stepped out of her sleek black Lamborghini Aventador. The car was her pride, a trophy earned through relentless nights of dedication, a sharp mind, and an unshakable determination to succeed in a world that often underestimated her. Her natural curls cascaded down her shoulders, a crown she wore with pride. She adjusted her blazer, the fabric hugging her like an armor of confidence, and reached for her designer handbag. Her presence commanded attention, the kind that turned heads not for vanity, but for the sheer aura of success and poise she carried. Jasmine locked her car and began her walk toward an upscale boutique in a posh neighborhood. The area was known for its high-end stores and luxury lifestyle, and she had finally set aside time to indulge in a bit of retail therapy, a rare treat in her busy life as the CEO of a thriving tech startup. But as her heels clicked against the cobblestone pavement, she felt it, a sharp gaze boring into her back, the kind of scrutiny that prickled her skin and sent an unspoken message. She stopped mid-step and looked up from her phone, her calm brown eyes scanning the street until they landed on him. A uniformed officer stood a few feet away, his stance rigid and authoritative. The badge on his chest gleamed in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the smirk tugging at his lips. His name tag read Carter, and his eyes carried a mixture of suspicion and condescension. Jasmine could almost feel the weight of his assumptions pressing down on her like an invisible shroud. "That's quite the car for someone like you," Carter said, his words sharp and dripping with implication. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she took a measured breath, her expression remaining calm and composed. "Excuse me," she replied, her tone polite but pointed, refusing to let his words unsettle her. Carter adjusted his belt, his smirk widening. "I said, that's quite the car for someone like you. You don't exactly look like you belong in this part of town driving that kind of vehicle." Jasmine's heart pounded with a mix of anger and disbelief, but she kept her emotions in check. Years of climbing the corporate ladder had taught her the value of composure, especially in moments designed to provoke. She tilted her head slightly, her brown eyes locking with his. "And what exactly does someone like me look like, Officer Carter?" Her words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in velvet. Carter hesitated, his smirk faltering for a brief moment before returning with renewed arrogance. "You know what I mean," he said, his tone casual but laden with meaning. Jasmine straightened her posture, her hand brushing against the sleek surface of her Lamborghini. "No, officer, I don't." "Perhaps you'd like to elaborate?" The tension between them crackled like static electricity. A small crowd began to gather, their curious gazes darting between Jasmine and the officer. The onlookers whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indignation. Carter glanced around, his confidence wavering under the weight of public scrutiny. "Just doing my job," he muttered, but Jasmine wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "Your job?" she asked, her voice steady and commanding. "And what part of your job involves making baseless assumptions about people based on their appearance?" The crowd murmured in agreement, a few people nodding their heads. Carter shifted uncomfortably, his smirk now replaced by a defensive scowl. "Look, I just thought it was suspicious, okay? A car like this." "A car like this," Jasmine interrupted, her voice rising slightly, "belongs to someone who worked hard, who earned it, and who refuses to let anyone diminish their success." "Is that suspicious to you, Officer Carter?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a young girl from the crowd spoke up. "She's right," the girl said, her voice loud and clear. "My dad says you shouldn't judge people by how they look." The crowd chuckled, and Jasmine couldn't help but smile at the girl's courage. Carter, on the other hand, looked visibly flustered. His authority, once so commanding, now seemed paper-thin under the weight of public opinion. Jasmine took a step closer to him, her voice soft but firm. "Next time, officer, I suggest you think twice before making judgments about someone based on nothing but your biases. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have somewhere to be. With that, she turned on her heel and walked toward the boutique, her head held high. The crowd parted for her, their admiration evident in their faces. As she stepped inside the store, Jasmine felt a surge of pride, not just for standing her ground but for proving, yet again, that her success was hers to define and defend. But little did she know, this encounter was just the beginning. Carter wasn't finished with her yet, and the events that would unfold next would test her strength, resilience, and the very foundation of her beliefs. An unjust interception. The boutique was as opulent as Jasmine had imagined. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over polished marble floors, and racks of designer clothes stood like curated art installations. The faint scent of jasmine, ironically her namesake, wafted through the air. It was the perfect escape from the unsettling confrontation with Officer Carter. A sales associate approached her, all smiles and deference. "Welcome, ma'am. Is there anything I can assist you with today?" Jasmine smiled back, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal a glimpse of genuine warmth. "Just browsing, thank you. But I'll let you know if I need anything." The associate nodded and retreated, leaving Jasmine to peruse the collection in peace. Yet, even as she admired a tailored suit in her favorite shade of emerald, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Carter's words lingered in her mind, a stain on an otherwise perfect afternoon. She brushed the thought aside. She had faced worse. As a black woman navigating the cutthroat world of tech entrepreneurship, Jasmine had learned to weather storms far more treacherous than a prejudiced police officer with a chip on his shoulder. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her assistant, Lila. "Client call rescheduled to tomorrow. Enjoy your day off, boss." Jasmine smiled. Lila always knew how to balance professionalism with a touch of care. Tucking her phone away, she turned her attention back to the suits, ready to indulge in a rare moment of self-care. But outside the boutique, trouble was brewing. Carter stood by Jasmine's Lamborghini, his radio crackling with intermittent static. The earlier encounter had left him feeling humiliated, and his ego demanded retribution. He wasn't one to be challenged, especially not in front of a crowd. The woman's confidence had rattled him, and now, standing alone beside the gleaming sports car, his mind churned with resentment. He glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, before pulling out his phone. He snapped a photo of the car, focusing on the license plate, and uploaded it to a database. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered under his breath. Moments later, his screen displayed Jasmine's name, her clean driving record, and the car's registration details, all legitimate. But Carter wasn't ready to let it go. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I need a tow truck at my location. We've got an illegally parked vehicle." The dispatcher hesitated. "Copy that, officer. What's the infraction?" Carter smirked, fabricating a response. "Blocking a fire hydrant." The lie was petty, but it was enough. Carter's heart raced with vindictive satisfaction as he awaited the tow truck. He knew it wasn't about the law, it was about control, about reminding people like Jasmine that they couldn't step out of line, no matter how successful they were. Inside the boutique, Jasmine had just finished selecting a few items when her instincts tugged at her. She glanced out the floor-to-ceiling windows and froze. There, in front of her car, was Carter, and behind him, a tow truck was pulling up. Her heart sank, not out of fear but frustration. She hurried to the cashier, quickly paying for her selections, and stepped outside, her heels clicking with purpose. The small crowd from earlier had dispersed, but a few curious onlookers lingered, their phones poised to capture the unfolding drama. "Officer Carter." Jasmine called, her voice ringing with authority. "What's going on here?" Carter turned, his expression a mix of feigned surprise and smugness. "Ms. Mitchell. Your vehicle is parked illegally, and I'm afraid it's being towed." Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She glanced at the curb, noting the absence of a fire hydrant or any other indication of a parking violation. "Illegally parked? I don't see a fire hydrant, nor any signs prohibiting parking. Care to explain? Carter's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. It's standard procedure, ma'am. If you have an issue, you can contest it at the precinct. The tow truck driver, sensing the tension, hesitated. Officer, are you sure this is? Just do your job, Carter snapped, cutting him off. Jasmine stepped closer, her calm demeanor replaced with a steely resolve. You're making a mistake, officer. I suggest you rethink this. Carter leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. And I suggest you know your place. The words sent a wave of fury through Jasmine, but she refused to let him see her falter. Instead, she reached for her phone and began recording. This is Jasmine Mitchell, she said, her voice steady. I am the registered owner of this vehicle, and Officer Carter here is attempting to tow it without cause. This is harassment, plain and simple. The crowd, emboldened by Jasmine's bravery, began to voice their support. She's right, someone shouted. There's no fire hydrant here. Carter's face flushed with anger. He gestured for the tow truck driver to proceed, but the man hesitated. Look, officer, I don't want any trouble. If she's got a point. Do your job, Carter barked, his authority cracking under the pressure of the growing audience. Jasmine stepped between the tow truck and her car, her phone still recording. You'll have to physically remove me if you want this car towed, she said, her voice unwavering. And I promise, this footage will make it to every news outlet in the city. Carter hesitated, his hand twitching toward his radio. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time, he realized he might have overplayed his hand. The standoff lasted several tense minutes, but ultimately, the tow truck driver refused to proceed. I'm sorry, officer, but I can't do this. It's not right. Carter clenched his fists, his frustration palpable. He turned to Jasmine, his voice low and threatening. This isn't over. Jasmine smiled, a hard edge to her expression. You're right, officer. It's just beginning. As Carter stormed off, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to Jasmine's courage. She turned to them, her phone still in hand. Thank you all for your support, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. But this isn't just about me. It's about holding people like him accountable. As the crowd dispersed, Jasmine leaned against her car, her hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline of the moment was wearing off, but her resolve remained intact. She had faced Carter's injustice head-on, but deep down, she knew this was far from over. Officer Carter wasn't the type to back down, and the battle ahead would demand every ounce of her strength, intelligence, and resilience. But Jasmine Mitchell was no stranger to challenges, and this time, she was ready to fight not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by power. The ripple effect. The next morning, Jasmine woke to a flurry of notifications on her phone. Her video from the previous day had gone viral overnight, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. Hashtags like #JusticeForJasmine and #AccountabilityNow were trending, with thousands of people rallying behind her. Messages of support flooded her inbox, ranging from friends and colleagues to complete strangers inspired by her courage. Jasmine scrolled through the comments, a mix of gratitude and frustration filling her chest. The outpouring of support was uplifting, but it also highlighted how common stories like hers were. She wasn't just one person standing up against injustice, she was a symbol of something bigger, a catalyst for change. But amidst the sea of positivity, there were darker undertones. Anonymous messages warned her to stay quiet. Some accused her of overreacting, while others hurled outright abuse. Jasmine had faced online harassment before. It was an unfortunate reality of being a successful Black woman in a visible position, but this time, the stakes felt higher. She exhaled deeply and put down her phone. Today wasn't about social media. It was about action. Jasmine arrived at her office, a sleek, modern space perched in the heart of the city. Her company, Mitchell Dynamics, was a tech powerhouse specializing in artificial intelligence and machine learning. It had taken her years to build it from the ground up, fighting for funding, recognition, and respect in an industry dominated by men. Now, it was a beacon of innovation and a testament to her perseverance. Her assistant, Lila, greeted her at the door, a concerned look on her face. "Morning, Jasmine. I saw the video, are you okay?" Jasmine gave her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, Lila. But we have work to do." Lila nodded, understanding the unspoken determination in Jasmine's voice. She followed her boss into the office, where Jasmine immediately began drafting a press release. "We're not letting this die down," Jasmine said as she typed. "This isn't just about me, it's about accountability, reform, and ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." Lila leaned over her shoulder, reading the document. "You're calling for a public inquiry?" "Exactly," Jasmine replied. "We need transparency. Carter isn't the first officer to abuse his power, and he won't be the last unless we take a stand." Meanwhile, in a dimly lit room across town, Officer Carter sat at his desk, his jaw clenched as he watched the video on his computer screen. His hands shook with anger. The once smug confidence that had fueled his actions now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the cold reality of public backlash. His superior, Captain Reynolds, entered the room, a stern expression on his face. "Carter, we need to talk." Carter stood, trying to mask his unease. "Captain, Save it," Reynolds interrupted. "Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've stirred up? The department is under fire, and it's because of your reckless behavior." Carter's face reddened. "She provoked me." That woman, Reynolds said, his voice sharp, "is a respected entrepreneur with a spotless record. And you? You put this entire department in jeopardy. We've been ordered to conduct an internal investigation, and until it's complete, you're on administrative leave." Carter's fists clenched. "You're just going to let her win?" Reynolds leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't about winning or losing, Carter. This is about accountability. And if we find any more dirt on you, I suggest you start looking for another line of work." Back at Mitchell Dynamics, Jasmine was preparing for a press conference. The company's conference room had been transformed into a media hub, with reporters from major outlets lining up to cover the story. Jasmine stood at the podium, her tailored suit immaculate and her demeanor calm yet resolute. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady, despite the flashes of cameras. "Yesterday, I experienced firsthand the kind of systemic bias that countless individuals face every day. Officer Carter's actions were not just an attack on me, they were an attack on fairness, justice, and the very principles this country claims to stand for." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'm not here to vilify the entire police force. I know there are good officers who serve with integrity. But accountability is not optional, it's essential. That's why I'm calling for a thorough investigation into Officer Carter's conduct and a review of the policies that allow such behavior to go unchecked." The room erupted into applause, but Jasmine wasn't done. "This isn't just my fight. It's our fight. And I won't rest until real change is made." As she stepped down from the podium, reporters bombarded her with questions, but Jasmine remained composed. Lila guided her to a quieter area, where they reviewed the responses pouring in from the press. "You were incredible," Lila said, her admiration evident. Jasmine smiled. "Thanks, Lila. But this is just the beginning." The pressure mounted over the next few days. The city's mayor released a statement supporting Jasmine's call for accountability, and civil rights organizations rallied behind her cause. Protests erupted, peaceful but powerful, with demonstrators holding signs that read "Justice for Jasmine" and "Reform Now." Carter, on the other hand, found himself isolated. Former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. His name was plastered across headlines, his reputation in tatters. But rather than reflect on his actions, he grew more resentful, blaming Jasmine for his downfall. Late one evening, Jasmine sat in her home office, reviewing documents for a legal case she was preparing to file against Carter and the police department. The lawsuit wasn't about money, it was about setting a precedent, about sending a message that abuse of power would not be tolerated. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed. It was a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Mitchell," a gravelly voice said. "You've made quite the impact." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady. "Who is this?" "Let's just say I'm someone who doesn't appreciate troublemakers," the voice replied. "You might want to reconsider your crusade. People like you don't always come out on top." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jasmine gripping the phone tightly. She felt a chill run down her spine but quickly steadied herself. This wasn't the first time she'd been threatened, and it wouldn't be the last. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She jotted down the details of the call, ready to report it to her legal team. If anything, the threat only solidified her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for a future where no one would have to endure what she had. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the city skyline. The battle ahead would be long and grueling, but she was ready. Because for Jasmine Mitchell, giving up was never an option. Into the storm. Jasmine Mitchell arrived at her office early the next morning, her resolve unshaken, despite the anonymous threats she had received the night before. She knew that stepping into the limelight of activism meant inviting resistance. What she didn't expect, however, was the growing number of allies joining her cause. As the sun rose over the city, Jasmine's team convened in the conference room. The air buzzed with determination as her colleagues and legal advisors reviewed their next steps. The civil lawsuit against Officer Carter and the police department had gained traction, and Jasmine's press conference had sparked discussions at every level of government. "Jasmine," Lila began, pointing to her tablet, "we've received offers of support from 3 major civil rights organizations. They're willing to help fund the lawsuit and provide additional legal counsel." Jasmine nodded, grateful, but focused. "That's good. We're going to need all the help we can get." "Have we heard back from the mayor's office?" Lila hesitated. "Not yet, but I've been in touch with their public relations team. They seem cautious, like they're waiting to see how this plays out." Jasmine sighed. "They're hedging their bets." Typical. Her head of legal, a sharp and tenacious woman named Caroline, spoke up. "We need to stay ahead of this. Carter's camp has been quiet, but I wouldn't underestimate them. There's a strong chance they'll try to discredit you." Jasmine's lips tightened. "Let them try. My record speaks for itself." Meanwhile, across the city, Carter sat in his modest apartment, surrounded by papers and legal documents. His administrative leave had left him isolated and bitter, but what stung the most was the public disgrace. His name had become synonymous with corruption, and his colleagues had all but abandoned him. He stared at his phone, scrolling through news articles and social media posts that painted him as the villain. He felt the walls closing in around him, but instead of introspection, he clung to his anger. In his mind, Jasmine wasn't a victim, she was the enemy, someone who had exploited the system to ruin him. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was his lawyer, a grizzled man named Frank Lawson. "We need to talk," Frank said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Carter gestured to the cluttered living room. "Talk about what?" "How I'm being railroaded." Frank dropped a folder onto the coffee table. "This isn't a witch hunt, Carter. You messed up, and now we're dealing with the fallout. The department's investigation isn't looking good, and Jasmine Mitchell's legal team is one of the best in the business." Carter's jaw tightened. "So, what? I just let her win?" Frank sighed. "It's not about winning or losing. It's about damage control. If we can settle out of court, it might save what's left of your reputation." Carter shook his head, his voice rising. "I'm not settling. She's the one who turned this into a circus, not me." Frank leaned forward, his tone firm. "You're not seeing the bigger picture, Carter. This isn't just about you anymore, it's about the entire department. And trust me, they won't hesitate to throw you under the bus if it means saving their own skin. The words hit Carter like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he realized how precarious his situation truly was. But instead of softening, his resentment deepened. If the department wasn't going to protect him, he'd have to fight back on his own terms. Back at Mitchell Dynamics, Jasmine was preparing for her next public appearance. A town hall had been scheduled for the evening, where community leaders, activists, and members of the public could discuss police reform and systemic bias. Jasmine had been invited to speak, and she knew it was an opportunity to amplify her message. As she reviewed her talking points, her phone buzzed. It was a call from an unknown number. Jasmine hesitated, then answered cautiously. "This is Jasmine." Ms. Mitchell, a calm, measured voice, replied. "This is Captain Reynolds from the police department. I'd like to meet with you." Jasmine's brow furrowed. "What's this about, Captain?" "I believe we have mutual interests," Reynolds said. "I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Would you be willing to meet at my office?" Jasmine considered his offer. On one hand, it could be a trap, a ploy to undermine her efforts. On the other, it could be an opportunity to push for real change. After a moment, she replied, "I'll meet with you, but on neutral ground. There's a cafe downtown, called Amara's. Tomorrow at noon." Reynolds agreed, and the call ended. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. What was Reynolds' angle? And could she trust him? The town hall that evening was packed, with standing room only. Jasmine took her place on the stage alongside other panelists, including community organizers and legal experts. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. When it was her turn to speak, Jasmine stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "I'm here today not just as someone who was wronged, but as someone who believes in the power of collective action. What happened to me was a symptom of a larger problem, a system that allows bias and abuse to go unchecked." The crowd erupted into applause, but Jasmine raised a hand, urging them to listen. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about accountability, transparency, and reform. We need to reimagine what policing looks like in our communities. And we need to do it together." Her words resonated deeply, sparking a passionate discussion among the attendees. People shared their own experiences with law enforcement, their voices filled with pain and frustration. But amid the stories of hardship, there was also a sense of solidarity, a belief that change was possible. As the town hall wrapped up, Jasmine was approached by a young man in his 20s. He introduced himself as Malik, a law student who had been following her story closely. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice earnest, "I just want to say thank you. What you're doing, it's inspiring. A lot of us feel powerless, but you're showing us that we can fight back." Jasmine smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Malik. And remember, this fight isn't just mine, it's ours. Keep studying, keep speaking out, and never underestimate your own power." As she left the venue, Jasmine felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would be difficult, but she wasn't walking it alone. And with every step, the tide of change grew stronger. The breaking point. The following day, Jasmine arrived at Amara's cafe promptly at noon. The small, cozy establishment hummed with the gentle clatter of dishes and the soft murmur of patrons. Jasmine spotted Captain Reynolds at a corner table, his posture stiff but his expression unreadable. Dressed in a crisp blue uniform, he stood as she approached, extending a hand. "Ms. Mitchell. Thank you for agreeing to meet." Jasmine shook his hand firmly, her gaze steady. "Let's cut to the chase, Captain. What do you want?" Reynolds gestured for her to sit. "Fair enough," he said, taking a seat across from her. "You've made your position clear, and I respect that. I wanted to meet because I believe there's a way we can work together to address the broader issues." Jasmine arched an eyebrow. "Work together?" After what happened with Carter, you think I'd trust your department? Reynolds sighed, his demeanor softening. I understand your skepticism. And you're right, our department has a lot to answer for. That's why I'm here. I want to reform the system from within, but I can't do it alone. Jasmine leaned back, crossing her arms. And what exactly are you proposing? Reynolds leaned forward, his voice low. I'm proposing a task force, civilian-led, with real authority to investigate misconduct and recommend policy changes. We need transparency, and we need voices like yours to guide us. Jasmine studied him carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity. And what about Carter? What happens to him? He's facing disciplinary action, Reynolds replied. The internal investigation is almost complete, and I can tell you this much, he won't be wearing a badge for much longer. Jasmine considered his words, her mind racing. A civilian-led task force was a step in the right direction, but it was only the beginning. Could she trust Reynolds to follow through? Or was this just another attempt to silence her? I'll think about it, she said finally. But understand this, Captain, I'm not compromising. If I feel for a second that this is a PR stunt, I'll expose it for what it is. Reynolds nodded. Fair enough. Later that evening, Jasmine met with her legal team and community allies to discuss Reynolds' proposal. Opinions were divided. Some saw it as an opportunity to create meaningful change, while others feared it was a trap to neutralize her momentum. Caroline, her head of legal, voiced her concerns. This could be a calculated move to make you look complicit if the reforms don't happen. Malik, the young law student who had approached her at the town hall, chimed in. But isn't this what we've been fighting for? A seat at the table? If we don't take this chance, we might not get another. Jasmine listened carefully, weighing their arguments. Finally, she raised a hand to quiet the room. This is about more than me. If we can use this opportunity to push for real accountability, then it's worth the risk. But we proceed on our terms. The room buzzed with agreement as Jasmine outlined her conditions for joining the task force. Transparency, independence, and a clear timeline for implementation, these were non-negotiable. Meanwhile, Carter's world continued to unravel. The internal investigation had uncovered a history of complaints against him, many of which had been buried under bureaucratic red tape. The media seized on the revelations, painting a damning picture of a man who had long abused his position of power. As the pressure mounted, Carter became increasingly desperate. He turned to Frank Lawson, his lawyer, for guidance. They're crucifying me out there, Carter shouted, pacing his apartment. I need a way to fight back. Frank remained calm, his voice steady. The best thing you can do right now is cooperate. If you show remorse. Remorse? Carter interrupted, his face red with anger. I didn't do anything wrong. She's the one who turned this into a spectacle. Frank stood, his patience wearing thin. You've got two options, Carter, keep digging yourself deeper, or take responsibility and try to salvage what's left of your life. Carter glared at him, but said nothing. Deep down, he knew Frank was right. But admitting fault felt like a betrayal of everything he'd clung to, his authority, his pride, and his twisted sense of justice. A week later, Jasmine sat in the mayor's office alongside Captain Reynolds and several city officials. After intense negotiations, they had reached an agreement, the formation of the Civilian Oversight and Reform Task Force, CORTF, with Jasmine as its inaugural chair. The announcement was met with widespread media coverage. Some hailed it as a groundbreaking step toward accountability, while others criticized it as a superficial gesture. Jasmine knew the real work was just beginning. Her first act as chair was to launch a comprehensive review of police policies and practices. She assembled a diverse team of experts, activists, and community members, ensuring that every voice was heard. Malik, now an intern with the task force, played a key role in drafting proposals for systemic change. As the task force gained momentum, Jasmine's lawsuit against Carter moved forward. The trial became a media spectacle, with both sides presenting their cases in excruciating detail. Jasmine's legal team highlighted Carter's history of misconduct, while Carter's defense attempted to paint him as a scapegoat for a broken system. In the end, the jury sided with Jasmine. Carter was found liable for harassment and abuse of power, and the court awarded Jasmine a substantial settlement. But more importantly, the verdict sent a clear message: no one was above the law. Months later, as Jasmine stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd of supporters, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The fight had been exhausting, and the scars it left were real. But so were the victories, the task force, the trial, and the growing movement for reform. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice ringing with determination. "This is just the beginning. Together, we've proven that change is possible. And together, we will keep fighting until justice isn't a privilege, it's a guarantee." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a chorus of hope and resilience. Jasmine smiled, feeling the weight of her accomplishments, but also the promise of the work still to come. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She hadn't just defended her dignity, she had sparked a revolution.